In today's reading, you get a sampling from Proverbs and a continuations from the letter of James and the Gospel of Mark. As I mentioned in passing last week, in the era of the Protestant Reformation, the letter of James became controversial. This was mainly because, for Martin Luther, it did not explicitly speak of Jesus and faith in Jesus the way that Paul did throughout his letters, and the letters attributed to him but written by his followers. Or at least, that is what Martin Luther's primary argument was. Martin Luther's actual main objection to James was the last line we read today. So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. One of Martin Luther's main tenets in his dispute with the Roman Catholic hierarchy was that we are saved through faith alone. And this sentence from James specifically contradicted that notion. But as I mentioned last week, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Communion, and various Lutheran denominations, including the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, have, over the past quarter century, come to a place of common understanding in this regard. And it is in understanding both Luther's context and that of James that this common understanding has come about. You see, Martin Luther lived in a time and a place when he was surrounded primarily by Germanic peasants. Their lives were hard. Children routinely died from contaminated water and starved and froze to death in winter. Women died in childbirth. Men died from accidents during farming and when they were forced into battle by one prince or another. And everyone died whenever there was a plague, bubonic or otherwise, sweeping the countryside. Death was a matter of life, and so fear of death and damnation were at the forefront of the minds of many of those that Martin Luther knew. They were all trying to live good lives, but they worried about themselves and their children. In Rome, St. Peter's Basilica, the center of Roman Catholicism, and in this time before the Protestant Reformation, all of Western Christendom had fallen into disrepair. The building was literally collapsing around priests, bishops, cardinals, and the Pope. It was becoming hazardous to celebrate Mass in St. Peter's. The Pope of the time decided that rather than trying to restore an over 1,000-year-old structure, a new building must be constructed. However, architects, artists, builders, and materials were not cheap, and the design chosen was colossal and magnificent. A major fundraising effort was required to construct the new St. Peter's Basilica. Already, the papistry was being funded through taxes on the peasants of the Roman kingdom and through kickbacks from bishops, archbishops, and cardinals through the taxing of their parishes for the positions. The church, as it existed, was built on the same structure as the rest of feudal Europe. The bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, and even the Pope were appointed lords with lands, and peasants working those lands. The castles, their staffs, the churches, and the priests all depended upon taxing of the peasants. And so when the Pope decided that the basilica needed to be rebuilt, it meant going to the poorest people in Europe and demanding more. But there had to be a reason for these impoverished people to give. And that is where the notion of indulgences came in. Built on a tiered structure, indulgences promised salvation for you and your kin. You could guarantee salvation for your children, your pregnant wife, your dying parents, and yourself. All you needed to do was donate to the Basilica Project, and you would get a certificate of salvation. Your work in your lord's or prince's fields could buy you salvation. With death already on the horizon, this was a deal. Starving people would give up what little they had. Starving today or tomorrow really made no difference. What really mattered was the eternity beyond. Martin Luther and others were aghast at this perversion of the scriptures and the message of Jesus, and rightfully decried the notion that salvation could be bought through these indulgences. But he did so in a manner that simplified the matter to the simple slogan, salvation through faith alone. And this was what put him at odds with the letter of James. In their specific context, however, James and Martin Luther really were on the same page. The letter of James was written as the church was expanding beyond Jerusalem and into the Gentile world. Distinctions were being made within the church. Powerful and influential people were being courted to protect the church against violence, and the cultural realities of the world were being remade in the church. Those in power and with wealth were being invited to sit in places of honor. Some even would come in the evening with a full meal prepared by their servants and start eating it before the rest of the assembly had finished their labors, and then continue while their brothers and sisters sat or braced themselves along the wall, waiting for their share of the bread and wine that would be the only food for the evening. Like Martin Luther centuries later, James saw the poor being taken advantage of in the name of Christianity, instead of being uplifted by it. And that is what he railed against in his letter. James believed that faith was the path to salvation, but that faith was something we live, not just something that we proclaim once, or still more precarious, is proclaimed once by friends and relatives at our baptism, and that is all that is asked for us as Christians. For James, saying one thing and doing another was not good enough. For James, true faith is that which is lived through loving your neighbor as yourself. True faith is following the steps of Jesus in healing the sick, opening the ears of those who are unable to hear God's message, giving voice to the disenfranchised, clothing the naked, and housing the unhoused. It is this shared understanding that salvation cannot be bought, but rather that salvation comes through a faith that is alive, that has led to a new common understanding among the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Lutheran denominations. Together, all preach in one voice the message of Jesus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.